Thank you all so much for coming today. My name is Zach Miller, and I am the program coordinator at Most Policy Initiative.
It looks like Zach lost his connection. Can everybody hear me all right? Yeah, so I will be co-hosting with Zach. I can take over for now until Zach gets back. But just real quickly, MOST is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. One of the primary things we do is that we connect scientists with legislators. So we have a fellows program in which our fellows talk with state legislators, they figure out what bills they're working on, and then go and create informational briefs. Another part of our mission is communicating science with a general audience, and this is why we set up this roundtable today. So I think we have a few panelists here today to talk about drinking water here in Missouri. And maybe could I have each of you introduce yourselves briefly, maybe starting with Charles here, since you're at the top of my screen.
Thanks, Tony. So my name is Charles Miller. I work at Missouri Confluence Waterkeeper. We're a nonprofit based in St. Louis that works statewide to protect folks' rights to swimmable, fishable water. My background is in water law, primarily, honestly, on the environmental side. So thinking more about surface water than drinking water. And a lot of our work revolves around environmental issues dealing with surface water, but we also do work on drinking water, especially on what you may have heard referred to as emerging contaminants. That's things like PFAS or forever chemicals and pharmaceuticals and other kind of unregulated things that might be in our waters.
Great, we're happy to have you. Maybe Deborah, could you introduce yourself real quick?
Yes, hello. My name is Deborah Rice Carter, and I am the Programs and Outreach Associate for Red Circle. And I'm here representing a Red Circle and trying to find out about the drinking water situation and helping our community be healthy. So that's what I'm here for.
And we appreciate your perspective. Professor Maria Fidalgo, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, good morning. My name is Maria Fidalgo. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Missouri in Columbia. I am a faculty member on the environmental side. I've been here at MU since 2014, and I was previously also working, teaching and doing research in another institution. So here I spend my time teaching undergraduate students about the fundamentals of environmental engineering and graduate students about the physical-chemical treatment processes. So those are mainly those involved in drinking water treatment. And in my research side, I work on sensors for detection of emerging contaminants in natural waters and also in advanced processes to address those new contaminants of concern for drinking water. And thank you so much for having me here.
We're happy to have you as well. And we have one more panelist who's having some audio issues. But we have Jeff Pinson from the Water Protection Program at Missouri Department of Natural Resources. And then maybe Zach, it looks like you're back and you've got internet again. So we've just done introductions with everybody. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for taking the reins. There's a thunderstorm happening right now at my house, and literally right as I introduce myself, everything just shut off. So thank you all for your patience. So we will overview Missouri's drinking water. We'll talk about some of the issues associated with drinking water. I know it has popped up in the news a number of times recently over the last few months. And then we will talk about what Missouri is doing in the form of solutions to come up with ways to solve these problems. And so the first question is for our panelists who is unable to get in, but it is, where does Missouri get its drinking water from? Maria, Charles, Deborah, if any of you can provide some insight to that, that would be helpful. And if not, we can just move on to the next questions.
Well, I really don't know exactly where it gets water from, but I used to live in Indianapolis, and I know working around the treatment center where they treat water, I'm sure they have the same thing here. It's a treatment center that the water comes from the river, I thought. So I don't know. So maybe I need to know more about that. But the treatment center is where all the water is processed that you drink, that's in your toilet, that comes through the toilet and everything. So it's just one system. The water goes there, they treat it with all these chemicals, and then they give it to us to drink or whatever we're going to do with it. So it all comes from the same place.
And Maria, the next question is for you. What is the traditional purification or treatment process for water in Missouri before it gets to residents' homes?
Yes, so the traditional or the conventional treatment process really varies depending on the type of water, the source of the water. So whether it is groundwater or surface water, so basically if it's a well or a river, the water comes from. And I cannot really talk to what is the most frequent source of water in Missouri. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I know at least there are sources. There are some cities that have wells as drinking water sources, and for example, Jefferson City has a river as the drinking water source. So there's both are relevant to Missouri. Both can be found in Missouri. So basically, just quick overview, using surface water as drinking water source. The treatment starts with a first very rough screening of the water, so just trying to remove the large solids that could be brought in the river. Some chemicals are added to promote the coagulation, so forming larger particles with the small particles that are there suspended. Then those particles settle in a sedimentation tank, those large tanks, if you have seen one of the treatment plants. So basically it's by gravity, you remove the particles. And after that, they move into the filtration, sand filtration. Sand filtration is where the smaller particles that cannot be removed by the sedimentation tank are finally
from in there.
separated.
Sorry, there's some audio in someone's background. Could everyone make sure to mute themselves so we can hear Maria well?
Thank you. And after the separation of the smaller particles, basically the water is potable for all in terms of the turbidity, but for the microbiological aspects, then the disinfection is needed. So then disinfectants are added, usually chlorine. That's why sometimes the water smells a little bit funny. And that addition of the disinfectant reduces the amount of pathogens in the water to levels that are not infective at the plant, and also some additional disinfectant is added to make sure that there's no regrowth, so you don't have more pathogens developing during in the distribution system. So basically what you have is a treatment targeting turbidity, suspended particles, and then pathogens, disinfection. In the case of groundwater, some of the units are similar, but you have you stress the particular water qualities of groundwater, which would be dissolved solids. So hard waters, groundwaters are usually harder. So there, the coagulant is added, is a different type of chemical, and it's targeting the separation of calcium and magnesium. So those incrustations that we found in the kettle when we prepare coffee, it all gets white. Well, that's what we're trying to remove from the groundwater, and then you remove that and you precipitate those salts. You filter with a sand filter, and of course you disinfect with the same precautions. And that is the conventional treatment. So targeting very conventional or normal aspects of water quality that you may find, just turbidity, particles, dissolved solids, and pathogen, and it's all natural. In the case of other contaminants, so man-made contaminants, then is where the system can become more complicated and more challenging to remove.
Okay, next question for Charles. What does drinking water regulation look like in Missouri? Who are the main actors and what are they looking for, and how do they go about testing to ensure that water is safe and high quality before it ends up in the homes of residents?
Yeah, so like with a lot of environmental law, the source of most of our drinking water regulations is federal law. It's implemented in something that's called a kind of cooperative federalism framework. You may have heard that referred to in the Clean Water Act context, which governs our waters that are kind of out there that are environmental, but the Safe Drinking Water Act has kind of the same framework. And what that cooperative federalism framework means is that the Congress and EPA, so the federal government, set the statutory and regulatory minimums for water quality, and then states can either go above that in some cases, or they implement the federal regs as they exist. And the states are kind of responsible for the day-to-day operations and monitoring. They certify operators, labs, and again, they're the ones who are kind of on the ground doing most of the kind of day-to-day work, following the framework that the federal government set forth. In terms of how frequently those waters are tested, that kind of varies by contaminant and also by the size of the water system. So for example, something that's required to be tested for under the Safe Drinking Water Act is fecal coliform. Depending on the size of the system and how many people it serves, they may test as frequently as every day or as few times as once a month. For turbidity, which is basically just a measure of how cloudy the water is, they're required to test once a day. Water systems are required to do twice a year tap water sampling for lead and copper specifically. But all of these are also, I think something that's important to keep in mind is these are minimums. And even if a state hasn't necessarily set stricter standards, a lot of the kind of larger systems, for example, like here in St. Louis, have basically like real-time monitoring of the quality of the water that they're putting out into the water main. So that's a long way of saying it depends on the contaminant, and it also kind of just depends on the capabilities of each individual system in terms of how frequently they're testing.
All right, thank you.
That's great to hear about the real-time monitoring. I was not aware of that. This next question is for Deborah. What are the water quality issues facing St. Louis today?
So the water quality issues that are facing St. Louis today are like the recent floodings have contaminated the system as far as runoff from the, the flood, everything, all the stuff has actually ran into the water that we are using for drinking purposes. And I'm concerned, and a lot of people are concerned with, are they testing the water? Are they really testing the water? Because I had someone come in my house and test the water for me, and I was shocked by everything that was found in the water. This is the drinking water. I live here in Ferguson. This is a residence. So, and then another thing was I was in a recent producers growing safety class, and they thought it was a need for water to be tested for the plants. Okay, so I mean it's well water, or producers who produce from their homes can get their water tested. But if they're concerned about water being contaminated for plants, what does that say about humans? So I'm just really concerned about it. And I'll just leave it there because I know the next question is going to be what I'm getting ready to talk about, which is health. So that's my concern. And that's what Missouri is facing as far as all these floods and water is running into our water system that we are drinking from. And are they getting the contaminants out like they say they're getting them out?
And Deborah, I'm curious, do you recall what some of those contaminants were that were found in your drinking water?
I had a list. I think I sent it to you. I'll go. Can you let me go and get my booklet? I will read them off to you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
And in the meantime, Maria, would you be able to speak to some of the main contaminants that Missouri faces?
Yes, sure. So in terms of contaminants, some of the contaminants that are of concern here in Missouri are really not exclusive of Missouri, but are found nationwide, but still related to the type of activities, human activities. In the particular situation of Missouri, you can find that there are more relevant things that that are more of concern. So within that frame, I would first mention pesticides. So pesticides have really been detected everywhere in the US, and both in groundwater and surface water. Although surface waters are more vulnerable just because they can be affected directly by runoff from agricultural activities. So that's something that we can really relate here in Missouri. For example, atrazine, which is a herbicide that is used a lot in the state and nationwide, actually has been detected in many areas, and you can find reports of occurrence of atrazine in many drinking water sources. So that's the concern. They are found in the source, and then if the treatment has not a special unit or a special addition to that conventional plant that targets directly the separation of the pesticide, that may be passed on to the consumers. And the standards for drinking water for all these contaminants I'm going to mention are really low. For example, for atrazine, it's only 3 micrograms per liter. That's the maximum contaminant level that it's allowed in drinking water in order to protect human health. And exposure can have a number of negative health impacts, and those are mainly related to chronic exposure, right? So higher incidence of cancers, cardiovascular disease, endocrine disruptor effects. So there's really there are many concerns related to that. Also, pharmaceuticals are a contaminant of concern that have been detected in many source waters, and those get to the waters due to the disposal of unused medications. So those medications, that prescriptions that you get and you don't really consume, and you dispose them just in the sewage. So that's really dangerous in terms of how it impacts the environment and our water sources. Excess, that's the problem. Excess medications, and then the health impacts of those can be very variable. Some of them can be directly a poison, but at the low levels, the concern is the chronic exposure of wildlife, the ecosystems, and humans to those that may lead to, again, larger incidence of cancers, changes or impacts in or disruptions in the endocrine system, which again leads to infertility, birth defects, and so on. So there's really a concern about those, and those compounds are really present at really low concentrations. Heavy metals also, they're in the news: arsenic, in some areas, it's natural presence, but still chronic exposure can lead to cancer and some other illnesses. Industrial wastewater can contain arsenic, lead. It has been in the news a lot, although not related to industrial wastewater or mining, as it could also be exposure, but directly to the corrosion of the plumbing system. So different sources, again, still a contaminant of concern at the top, at the customer side, at the homes of the customers. Emerging contaminants of concerns are PFAS, and there has been some mention of PFAS, the polyfluoroalkyl substances. That's a mouthful, so we all are going to recognize them by the shorter PFAS. Those are compounds that we're just finding out what the health implications are. There are strong indications that they accumulate in organisms, humans, and wildlife, and that accumulation can be problematic and lead to health effects. However, there's still no regulation. And finally, I'd like to mention really briefly microplastics. So those small particles of plastics that are a result of the disposal of larger plastics that we use and reach the natural waters and in the environment. They break down to smaller pieces and about millimeter size, 1 to 5 millimeter size. And those, again, stay in the environment for a really long time. They have the ability to accumulate, and we're not really sure what the consequences to the health they have, but there are concerns. There are things that we're doing research and we're trying to understand a little bit more.
Great, thank you for that insight, Professor. This next question is for Charles. Are there certain communities or regions of the state that face more frequent water quality problems?
Yeah, I would want to kind of spotlight two broad areas, and I think this is kind of something that's common to a lot of policy things, not just in the environmental world, but kind of overall. I think there's obviously problems. I think we've talked a lot about lead today, and those problems tend to be concentrated in urban areas. And there's also problems related to kind of expenses and just the resources that are available to communities in rural areas that run their own drinking water systems. So in terms of lead pipes and lead service lines, the lines that run basically to your house from the main, that's a big problem. And it's a big problem in Missouri, even though perhaps we haven't gotten quite the press of a place like Flint, Michigan, or something like that. I know the city of St. Louis Waters treats their water in a specific way that is intended to avoid the corrosion of lead pipes. So it's such a problem in St. Louis that they've had to change the methods that they use to treat the water. There are solutions out there for folks who have lead service lines. There's grant funding out there, but most of the time those costs fall on the consumer. They fall on the homeowner. EPA's put out some cost estimates. They say the average cost is about $5,000 to replace a lead service line, but it can be anywhere from $1,000 to $12,000. And I think for anybody that's a lot of money, but that's certainly a lot of money for lower income folks. And you know, if you're somebody who rents rather than owns, you don't really have the ability to replace those lead service lines because you don't own the property. I did mention there are a lot of grant programs out there, and there's a lot of creative ways that utilities have addressed this issue in some other states as well. Back in 2019, EPA put out a really, really cool document called Strategies to Achieve Full Lead Service Line Replacement. I think I included that in the resources that the folks are going to send out after this. But a big part of the issue is just that people don't know about the fact that they can get money to replace their lead service lines. Our elected officials don't always know some of these creative solutions. So if this is something that you're interested in, either for yourself or your community, I would suggest, looking at this document, especially if you have the ear of an elected official, be that at the state level, federal level, local level, even, share this document with them and let them know that there are solutions to these problems and that there's some other solutions apart from kind of placing the burden on individuals. And there's ways that municipalities and utilities can actually address this in a more holistic way. As to the rural issues, I think one of the things that really is just an issue, and this is not unique to Missouri by any stretch of the imagination, is that drinking water purification is pretty expensive. And I just, for an example for this, I looked at the budget of Neosho, Missouri, which is in the southwest part of the state. And it's a city that's got about 12,000 people. And their annual budget is $33 million. And, for those of us who deal with state or federal policy, that's not a lot of money, right? And 8 million of that alone is going to water and wastewater treatment. That's a quarter of the city's budget. So that's a big dent that is going to happen if that for some reason gets more expensive, either because they have to meet new standards, they discover that there's some kind of new contamination, or they just have to upgrade their facilities. I think that's really magnified when it comes to these emerging contaminants. EPA is in the process of coming up with drinking water standards for PFAS. But meeting those standards is going to require, in most cases, the installation of some new equipment, and that's going to be costly. Another thing to keep in mind, especially in areas where maybe you've got an older treatment facility, is it may be located in a position where there's not room to expand it. Like there's no room to expand its footprint. And so in order to meet these standards, cities are going to have to come up with creative ways to, possibly, build a new treatment facility somewhere else. And so those are kind of the big issues in rural areas, although I will touch on one last thing that doesn't necessarily fit into kind of the public drinking water rubric that we've been talking about. But there are a lot of folks on private wells in Missouri. And again, that's a situation where kind of the onus of testing those private wells falls on the people who drink from them. And the state does have resources for folks to test their wells for free. But again, not everybody is aware of those resources. And just to add to the issues of private wells is, the Safe Drinking Water Act has protections for source waters for public water systems. It doesn't have protections for groundwater for private wells. So that's just another layer of protection that folks who are on well water unfortunately don't have.
Thank you for that, Charles. I live rurally in Wooldridge, Missouri, and I am on a private well, so I appreciate that information, and I will look into having it tested. I didn't know I could do that. Deborah, I'd like to return to you. As we left off, you were going to try to find the document to see what contaminants your water had in Ferguson.
Well, the doctor kind of went over the things that, I had wrote down, like arsenic and lead and barium and the plastic situation with the, the plastic bags. They don't disintegrate, and that stuff is getting into our system. So is it building up in our system? That's a concern. What is it doing to our system? It's all mostly microorganisms and toxins in our water system. You putting toxins in to take toxins out, and it doesn't seem like, it seems to me like something could cross up and it's not good for our system again. All these purifiers and chemicals they're putting into the water to purify it. And then we have stuff coming in from runoffs, and I'm just concerned that we're not getting everything out. And, it's coming up in a lot of EPA, and they're finding all these contaminants in our drinking water. And, like I said, it's causing our whole humanity to be contaminated. So I'll put it like that. So We have to find some way in order to prevent this. And the thing that I do now is I filter all my water. So I don't, if that helps, but is it getting everything out, by filtering it? So
Yeah. Could you share with the attendees here how you went about having your water tested?
so the first time I had it tested in the house, I think it was something that came over the internet. I don't know. The man came in, was it Collagen? One of those water treatment system. It might have been Home Depot. I don't know. But they came in and he tested it. And what he was trying to do was to sell me this water softener thing that cost over $10,000. I can't afford that. So, you know, so I was left with like, what am I going to do? He showed me all this water that he took out of the faucet and he put something in it and all these particles were in it. And it just scared me. It scared me right away. So, and then I've always been scared of drinking the water out of the faucet because I've lived in other states. And when you go from one state to the other, the water doesn't taste the same. So that's another thing that concerns me. And then with all these water scares coming from other cities, that doesn't say that we're safe. It might happen to us any day. We might have to do the same thing, maybe Gary, Indiana. We don't know. We trust in people with our health. We need to proactively do stuff that helps ourselves and not depend on all this other. They say they test in the water. How many times do they test it? Do they need to test it every hour? It's just water is a big thing to our health humanly. We have to have water to live, and it just seems like it's it's getting scary. And another thing I'm worried about is the water systems being open and terrorism. I mean, you can't put that, out of your mind because they have terrorism. You don't know who's working in these plants. If they're going to contaminate and kill all of us, you know. So, yeah, it is a problem. We have to have water, and the water that we're drinking is not safe.
Okay, the next question is for Professor Fidalgo. Your research seems to be very applied. You got aspects touching on both treatment and monitoring of water. Could you share a little bit more about your research and how your findings might be useful for improving water quality in Missouri?
Yes, sure. So as I said before, my research looks at quality in treatment as sort of more a complete problem because a lot of these new emerging contaminants actually we just recently are developing the means to measure them, and in particular if you think about the microplastics, one of the main research issues today is to find a standard method to detect and compare levels of microplastics. So there's still ongoing work. So the sensing has to go, hand in hand with the treatment. And one thing that in all our projects in my lab, we look very COLSIS. This is one of the main criteria for the development of both the sensing and the treatment processes is that we want those to be safe, is simple enough that don't require a lot of training or very specialized operators to run them, and also to be a low cost, so making them affordable. So in order to have a larger impact, so that with that we expect to maximize the impact and to simplify that transfer of the technology to the communities that can apply it. So in particular, I'd like to give you two quick examples of projects that I'm working with my students in the lab. And one is a sensor. It's a plastic strip. So if you've been in the lab or you've been exposed to those paper strips for measuring the pH. This is a similar sensor, but actually can measure some of those organic contaminants that I was talking about earlier. So for example, we work on atrazine and the metabolites, so those compounds that are formed as a result of the partial degradation of the pesticide itself in natural water. So we want to develop a tool that can be used in the field directly, very simple, but just any person, so just any person in the community should be able to use this tool to test the level of atrazine in the waters and understand whether it is low, below or over the MCL, the maximum contaminant level for drinking water. So that could be an early detection tool and a screening tool. So if then you find the pesticide or the antibiotic in your water on this particular source of water, then you can take action. The action can be different. The way the action looks can be different in different places, but information, just empowering the community to be informed and understand the water quality, is really important. On the other side, we're working on treatments. One of the very exciting projects that we're doing right now is development of a treatment for PFAS using as a catalytic treatment. So it's a chemical oxidation, strong chemical oxidation. PFAS are known as forever chemicals. That means they're really, really hard to destroy. Nature cannot destroy it easily by itself. And we're using just strong chemical reactions to do that. So we fabricated a catalyst based on iron. So this is not a toxic or hazardous chemical. Is iron and hydrogen peroxide, and the catalyst works as helps the reaction, but also separates. So we're doing sort of a filtration reaction system, and this is something we just started, and we're working with a group of students. But we're very excited to be able to test, and hopefully we can optimize it so the reaction becomes. The process becomes something that can efficiently be applied. And it's not only safe and simple, but also being simple materials means fairly low cost and low energy intensive, which is one of the problems that some of the current technologies for PFAS destruction have, the thermal treatments. And so, and I would like to add just one more layer as how it impacts water quality in Missouri, because these projects are at the lab scale. So it's going to take a while until they are fully transferred. So we cannot expect to see them next month or maybe not even next year impacting our water treatments. But we have a direct impact because we have students working and in those labs while they're being trained as engineers, as environmental engineers, as water scientists, and those are the ones that are going to be working in the state. So we're forming fully informed professionals that are aware of the tools and the problems that we have currently, and they are the ones that are going to make a big impact and improve water quality in Missouri. So I'm really hopeful for that.
That is exciting. Thank you. And Charles, to you, what are some other concrete steps that you think Missouri could take on to improve water quality across the state?
So I think the main thing that we need to do, and again, like I've shown my hand, I'm biased, my background's in like the outdoor water, but I think we do. I mean, everybody knows the water cycle diagram that you saw in 4th grade or whatever. Our legal framework for this treats drinking water and surface water and groundwater kind of separately. And we know that that's not the reality. So I think one thing that we need to do is have that kind of holistic view of water. I think there's also a really great example of something that's happening right now in St. Charles that demonstrates why we need really kind of robust and redundant water infrastructure. So those of y'all that live in the St. Louis area might have seen this. Some of y'all who don't may not have, but there's been some contamination issues with some wells in St. Charles. St. Charles gets its water from groundwater. near the Missouri River. And to the city of St. Charles's credit, before they even hit like the Safe Drinking Water Act, MCL, they shut it down as soon as they had a detection of this chemical. But they're able to do that because of a couple things. One, they have multiple wells. Two, right now they're buying water from the city of St. Louis, and not every community has that option. And it's really important to kind of provide these backup plans that are something other than trucking in water from somewhere else or buying bottled water for residents, because both of those are tremendously expensive just because it's so expensive to move water over long distances. And when it comes to bottled water, that's generally not going to be of higher quality than tap water. And one thing I will flag as well, just kind of on the consumer awareness side, is that anybody who's on a public water system should be getting in the mail every year something called a Consumer Confidence Report. That's something that's required under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And that's going to list out every regulated chemical under the Act, and it's going to show you what the level that EPA considers too high. It's going to show you the MCL, and it's going to show you what was detected in your drinking water system. Obviously, we've talked about lead service lines, things of that nature. Contaminants can be introduced after they leave a plant, but I think consumer confidence reports are both a really good tool to understand what's going on with your water, and generally are going to give you a little more confidence about what is actually in your water. And I'm going to share in the chat, there's a link where even if you haven't gotten it in the mail this year, you can look it up on EPA's website, and that'll have the most recent one. And if you're interested in the water for a family member who lives halfway across the country, you can look it up there. And so again, just kind of treating these things as holistic and being aware and making sure that legislators and regulators hear that this is something you're concerned about. It seems so basic, and it's something that we kind of take for granted. And just letting people know that it's something that's important to you as a resident of the state, as a voter, that goes a long way.
Great. And then one more question for Professor Fidalgo. Could you tell us more about the Missouri Water Center and how that might serve water quality in Missouri more broadly?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So last year, the Missouri Water Center was created at the University of Missouri here in Columbia, where we previously had different groups of water-related scientists working in this problem. So there were people in engineering, but that's where I am. There was a group, Watershed Management Center, looking at the aspect of natural resources, floods and drought. And some people looking at economic and social problems related to water. But in fact, and I'm going to take from what Charles was explaining just a minute ago, having a more holistic look at the water problem is going to help solve a lot more problems, or actually get to solve the problem, just looking at overall. So this is one of the big strengths that the creation of this Missouri Water Center brings. So it puts together in the same environment all these researchers or these resources that the state has here at the university, so we can work together, collaborate more, exchange information, and actually solve the problems in a more interdisciplinary way. So we're looking at things like protecting our water resources. So if we protect the water resource better before it gets contaminated, then we won't have much problems during the treatment. So better to do it before. And just looking at how can improve resilience in the state to floods and drought. There's water, but maybe there are times when you have too much and times when you don't have enough. So how can you do a better water management or your water resources management? and then support the development of these new technologies that are going to be needed for those emerging contaminants. And that expertise is also needed in the States. So basically, we're going to try to avoid contamination, but we know PFAS is everywhere. We know microplastic is probably there. We need to learn and develop the expertise to be able to monitor the water quality and be proactive in that here in the state of Missouri. That in conjunction with a strong emphasis in technology transfer, so we can really transfer everything we learn to the communities and impact the people, and training the students. As I was saying, this is really important, have a very well-informed, very relevant in terms of topics, group of students graduating from the university. So I think the impact of the Missouri Water Center in the state is going to be really important.
Okay, thank you. And I want to ask there are a few questions from the audience. So the first one is, how are pharmaceuticals and personal care products being monitored in Missouri drinking water? And then also associated, is there any work being done to develop gray water capture systems in residential situations? And if you don't feel like you can speak to that, we can come up with some answers and send it out as resources afterwards. Another question from the chat was, what is the best message when approaching schools if they're afraid of repercussions if they find lead in their water?
Well, I think, I don't have a ton of expertise on this issue, but for one thing, again, we talked about there's resources out there for homeowners, and there's certainly resources out there for public schools. And, I think everybody does, when you send your kid to school, you want to know that they're going to be safe from all kinds of things. And I think, again, like drinking water is kind of a super basic thing that we all just kind of take for granted. So I would say, everybody here wants what's best for the kids who are going to this school. If this is an issue, we need to know. There's money out there. The legislature in Missouri passed a law recently to up testing of school drinking water for lead. And, it's better if we nip it in the bud rather than kind of stick our heads in the sand.
And then one more question from the audience was, do you feel that federal law is very punitive? For example, in the case of Jackson, to what extent do federal laws help cities improve their water quality besides issuing fines for not meeting the stated standards? For example, corrective action.
I guess as the person with the law degree, I'll take this one. I think I worked in enforcement at EPA briefly when I was in law school, and I'll say this: when it comes to public entities, the EPA is not looking to just go stick people with fines. Like, they're not looking to, go as hard as they can against a municipality, especially if it's one that's got a history of problems, and especially if it's one, I think, like Jackson in Mississippi, that doesn't really have the kind of tax base that they need to make these improvements. And, I think one thing to keep in mind is problems that have happened in Jackson or Flint. These aren't the products of a single error that somebody made 2 years ago. These are kind of cascading problems that have just snowballed to this point. So I think one thing EPA would do, and I think this is happening in the context of Jackson, is that they're able to send people out to do kind of technical assistance and say, okay, let's look and see what the specific problem is with your drinking water system. Let's come up with a plan, and let's try to marshal some federal resources in terms of how we can fix this. So I think EPA takes a very collaborative approach to how they deal with violations of the Safe Drinking Water Act by utilities. Again, I think their main concern, they're not about enforcing the law. They really are genuinely about trying to fulfill the promise of those environmental laws. And in the Safe Drinking Water Act context, that means getting water that's safe to as many folks as possible.
All right, thank you very much, Charles. So we are approaching the end of our 1 hour. I'm dropping in the chat right now a short evaluation. If you wouldn't mind, fill that out to help us improve these roundtables in the future. This is a monthly series, so we will have some upcoming roundtables over the next few months that you can look out for. And to wrap up, I would like each of the panelists to just offer us a few sentence takeaways that if Missourians only heard one short message from this call, what would you like them to hear? And we will start off with Deborah.
I'm sorry, my mic was off. I would tell Missourians to proactively get their water tested in their homes so they can know exactly what they're dealing with. So that's my take on this.
All right, thank you very much. And we'll include in some follow-up emails some resources and documents that will point to ways that folks can get their water tested. And then next up, we'll do Charles.
I would just say, and I'm a policy guy, so I sound like a broken record because I say this about everything, but really make sure that your elected officials, the people who work at DNR, understand how important clean water is to you, both for your family in terms of drinking, outdoors in terms of recreation, fishing, etc., and let them know it's a priority, because we really do just have some incredible water resources in this state, and a lot of times, legislators need a little push to recognize that and take the correct steps. So just let them know.
All right, thank you very much. And last but not least, Maria.
Thanks. So I would add to those two things that were put out there that I completely agree with, that although there are challenges, and we know of those challenges because we actually went out and tried to understand water quality and test. So information is key. So we need to know, we need to make sure we request the information, and when there are laws that protect us, we know and we really enforce that. And these challenges, they are big, but there is hope, and we're advancing. The technology and science is advancing every day, and we will get all these problems solved. It's not a moment to lose hope. Just to get it, just it's important to be informed and to know what's going on, but there's not a moment to lose hope. We can be protected.
All right. Thank you very much. And again, we will send out a follow-up email that will point to all of the resources that the panelists mentioned today. And you can be on the lookout for our next roundtable in January, which will touch on climate change and national security. And if you wouldn't mind, please fill out the evaluation so you can help us improve these for the future. And with that, we can wrap up the meeting. Thank you all so much for coming, and a thank you to the panelists for attending.